March 9th, 1945. The Mariana Islands, a chain of volcanic rock and hard-won coral runways in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. As the tropical sun began its descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, a new and terrible kind of sunset was being prepared on the ground. Across the sprawling American airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, islands that just months earlier had been fiercely defended Japanese territory, now transformed into the largest and most powerful air bases on the planet. A scene of immense, purposeful, and ominous activity was unfolding. On the vast concrete and crushed coral runways, stretching for miles across the captured landscape, thousands of ground crew personnel performed their final, meticulous checks on a staggering armada of 325 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers. The very air thrummed with the low, guttural growl of auxiliary power units and the clatter of tools on metal. In the cavernous bomb bays of these silver giants, which had been packed far beyond their normal design capacity, highly trained ordnance crews carefully loaded and armed thousands of E-46 cluster bombs. Each of these clusters contained a sinister payload of 38 M69 incendiary bomblets. Each individual bomblet, a 6-pound hexagonal steel tube filled with a revolutionary and terrifying new substance, napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture that would burn with an almost unquenchable fury at over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This mission, codenamed Operation Meeting House, was the brainchild of the newly appointed commander of the XXI Bomber Command, Major General Curtis LeMay. A man known for his cigars, his taciturn demeanor, and his ruthless, unsentimental approach to warfare, LeMay had ordered the most radical, dangerous, and controversial change in bombing tactics of the entire Pacific War. The objective was both coldly strategic and deeply unsettling: the densely populated Shitamachi district of eastern Tokyo. This was a sprawling, low-lying area of the city where an estimated 750,000 people lived in traditional, tightly packed wooden and paper homes, crammed into a mere 12 square miles of urban landscape. It was a city built of kindling, a fact that American war planners, after months of frustratingly ineffective high-altitude raids, were now prepared to exploit with a terrifying new efficiency. At 1735 hours, as the last light of day faded from the sky, the first of the gleaming silver B-29s, its 4 massive engines straining at full power, lifted heavily off North Field on Guam. It was the beginning of a relentless, hours-long procession. Through the gathering darkness, the night was torn apart by the deafening, soul-shaking roar of Wright, our 3350 engines as bomber after bomber took to the skies, not in the tight, defensive formations of the European theater, but flying individually, separated by minutes, navigating alone through the vast, dark emptiness towards a single, shared point of destruction. In a move that was both a calculated risk and a testament to the new strategy's core logic, LeMay had ordered the bombers stripped of most of their defensive machine guns and ammunition, a radical decision that horrified many of the crews. This drastic weight reduction, however, allowed each B-29 to carry a crushing double load of incendiary bombs. Leading this massive and unprecedented aerial assault were specialized Pathfinder aircraft, whose sole, critical mission was to arrive over the target first and mark the designated aiming point with a massive, burning X of napalm, a fiery beacon that would be visible for miles to the main bomber stream that followed. The main force, instead of bombing from the relative safety of 30,000 feet, will be dropping their devastating loads from the terrifyingly low altitudes of just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, a mere fraction of their designed bombing altitude, placing them directly within the effective range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns. What would unfold over the next 8 hours in the skies above and the streets below Tokyo would demonstrate the overwhelming, almost elemental power of American incendiary warfare. It would also reveal, with tragic clarity, why Japan's desperate and courageous air defenses, despite their fierce determination, were utterly incapable of preventing what would become the single most destructive and deadly air raid in the entirety of human history. The weapon at the heart of this new strategy, the American Boeing B-29 Superfortress, had arrived in the Pacific theater as, without question, the most technologically advanced and complex aircraft of the Second World War. A true revolutionary leap in aeronautical design. This massive bomber was the result of over 1.4 million engineering man-hours and represented a staggering national investment of over $3 billion, a sum that, in a telling comparison of national priorities, far exceeded the $1.9 billion cost of the Manhattan Project, which was simultaneously developing the atomic bomb. This four-engine heavy bomber incorporated a host of groundbreaking and unprecedented features that placed it a generation ahead of any other aircraft in the sky. Its crew compartments in the nose and mid-fuselage were fully pressurized, allowing the crew to operate in relative comfort on long, high-altitude missions without the need for clumsy oxygen masks. Its defensive armament of 10.50 caliber machine guns was housed in a series of remote-controlled turrets, ingeniously operated by gunners sitting at computerized sighting stations, a system that provided a devastatingly effective field of fire. And its four massive Wright-R 3350 duplex Cyclone engines were the most powerful piston engines ever fitted to an aircraft at the time, each 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial powerhouse, producing a thunderous 2,200 horsepower. The manufacturing of this aerial behemoth was a monumental undertaking in itself, a testament to the sheer scale and efficiency of the American wartime economy. The effort was distributed across the entire nation, with Boeing producing the bombers at its massive plants in Seattle, Renton, and Wichita, the Glenn Martin Company building them at its facility in Omaha, Nebraska, and the Bell Aircraft Corporation churning them out from its factory in Marietta, Georgia. Each B-29 was a giant, stretching 99 feet in length with a colossal wingspan of 141 feet. It was a weapon of intercontinental reach, capable of carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs over a combat radius of 1,600 miles, flying at altitudes up to 31,850 feet with a maximum speed of 357 miles per hour, faster than most of the Japanese fighters that would be sent to intercept it at high altitude. By March of 1945, American factories had delivered approximately 2,000 of these incredible machines to combat units, with production accelerating relentlessly toward the eventual wartime total of 3,970 aircraft. This massive and sustained manufacturing effort was something that Japan, with its shattered industrial base, could not even begin to comprehend, let alone match. Boeing's Wichita plant alone, at the peak of its production, was producing 4.2 Superfortresses per working day. The command structure for this new strategic weapon was unique. The 20th Air Force, commanded personally from the Pentagon by the visionary General Henry Hap Arnold, had deployed these strategic bombers first from hastily constructed bases in China, beginning in June of 1944. These early raids, launched against targets in Japan from extreme range, had proven to be logistically nightmarish and largely ineffective. The true strategic bombing campaign against Japan began in earnest only after the capture of the Mariana Islands. Starting on November 17, 1944, the newly formed XXI Bomber Command began its operations, flying from the sprawling airfields on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. This command operated three massive bombardment wings from the Marianas, the 73rd and 313th Bombardment Wings based on Saipan, and the 314th Bombardment Wing on Guam. Together, these units could now deploy over 300 B-29s for a single, overwhelming mission, each complex aircraft maintained and serviced by an army of specialized ground crews working around the clock in the sweltering Pacific heat. Standing in stark, almost pathetic contrast was the state of Japan's air defense system in the spring of 1945. It was a system plagued by inter-service rivalry, technological backwardness, and a crippling lack of resources. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy continued to operate separate, almost completely uncoordinated air defense command structures, with minimal and often hostile communication between the two services. Their primary night fighter, the Nakajima J-1 Ngekko, or Moonlight, had been hastily and inadequately converted from a twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft. Its primary armament consisted of twin 20mm Type 99 cannons firing upward at a 30-degree angle from the fuselage, a configuration known as Schrägmusik, and another pair firing downward, a system that theoretically allowed the fighter to attack the bombers from their blind spots. However, Japan had managed to produce only 479 of these specialized aircraft throughout the entire war, and many of those had already been lost in combat or to operational accidents. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, or Dragon Killer, served as another night fighter option, a heavy twin-engine fighter equipped with a powerful 37mm cannon in the nose and, in some variants, oblique-firing 20mm cannons. But its performance was sluggish, and only 1,701 had been manufactured since 1941. Critically, and fatally for their chances of success, neither of these aircraft was equipped with effective airborne interception radar. This meant that at night, they were almost completely blind, relying on the primitive and largely useless methods of being guided by ground-based searchlights and the sheer luck of making a visual identification of a fast-moving bomber in the vast, inky blackness of the night sky. The ground-based defenses were equally, and tragically, inadequate. The entire Tokyo metropolitan area, a sprawling urban landscape home to millions of people, was defended by fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns. The Type 99 88mm gun, a respectable weapon, provided the main high-altitude defense, while the smaller Type 98 20mm cannon offered some close-range protection, but its effective ceiling was only 11,500 feet, far below the B-29's normal operating altitude. Most critically, Japan lacked effective fire control radar for its anti-aircraft artillery. Their gunners were forced to depend instead on optical rangefinders and sound locators, technologies that were utterly useless in poor weather, against cloud cover, or at night. The cold, hard numbers told a damning and challenging story. While America could deploy hundreds of B-29s from the Marianas alone for a single raid, the combined Japanese forces could muster perhaps only 200 operational night fighters throughout the entire home islands by March of 1945. Crippling fuel shortages had severely restricted training flights, leaving new pilots with almost no night flying experience. Aviation gasoline had become so scarce and precious that many aircraft were kept grounded simply to preserve fuel for the final, desperate defensive operations against the expected American invasion of the homeland. Major General Curtis LeMay had assumed command of the XXI Bomber Command in January of 1945, inheriting a strategic bombing campaign that was, by every objective measure, failing to achieve any decisive or even meaningful results. The previous high-altitude, daylight precision bombing raids, conducted from the B-29's operational ceiling of 30,000 feet, had proven to be shockingly ineffective and incredibly costly. The primary culprit was a newly discovered and completely unanticipated meteorological phenomenon, the jet stream. At these extreme altitudes over Japan, the bombers encountered powerful, river-like winds that often exceeded a staggering 200 miles per hour. These ferocious, unpredictable winds made a mockery of the Norden bomb site's precision, scattering the bombs for miles across the landscape, miles away from their intended industrial targets. The sheer mechanical strain on the B-29s was also immense. The long, arduous climb to high altitude with a heavy bomb load placed a tremendous stress on the right R-3350 engines, causing frequent and often catastrophic mechanical failures. The engines, particularly their magnesium alloy components, were prone to overheating beyond their safe operating temperatures, leading to a terrifying number of in-flight fires and aborted missions. Compounding these problems, persistent and heavy cloud cover obscured the targets a staggering 70% of the time, forcing the bombardiers to rely on their primitive, early-generation H-2X radar systems, which provided a crude and often misleading picture of the ground below. After weeks of meticulously analyzing these frustrating operational challenges, poring over after-action reports, and consulting with his meteorologists and staff, LeMay made a revolutionary and incredibly audacious decision, one that would completely transform the air war against Japan. His new tactics were radical, they were dangerous, and they went against every established doctrine of American strategic bombing, but they were also brutally and undeniably logical. First, LeMay ordered that all of the B-29's defensive guns and their heavy ammunition be removed, with the sole exception of the tail gunner's position. This heretical move, which initially sent a wave of fear and protest through the combat crews who felt they were being stripped of their only means of defense, was a calculated gamble. The massive weight savings, however, allowed each B-29 to carry a crushing 7-ton load of incendiary bombs, a dramatic increase from the usual 3.5-ton load of high explosives. Second, he ordered the bombers to attack at the shockingly low altitudes of 5,000 to 9,000 feet. This would completely avoid the treacherous jet stream, dramatically reduce the strain on the engines, and allow for a far greater degree of bombing accuracy. Third, the attacks would take place at night. This would minimize the bombers' exposure to the small and poorly equipped Japanese day fighter force and would largely negate the threat from anti-aircraft artillery, which lacked effective radar guidance. Finally, the bombers would not fly in the tight, mutually defensive formations that have been the hallmark of the air war over Europe. Instead, individual aircraft would navigate to the target alone, using the newly deployed and highly accurate Lorne radio navigation signals, and attack in a continuous, relentless bomber stream over a period of several hours. This bomber stream tactic, pioneered by the British, was designed to completely overwhelm the enemy's centralized command and control system, making it impossible for them to vector their few night fighters onto any specific target. The plan was a roll of the dice, a radical departure from everything the crews had been trained to do. But for the night of March 9th to 10th, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. LeMay's meteorologists predicted absolutely perfect conditions for the new tactics. Clear, moonless skies over Tokyo, with strong and steady surface winds that would act as a bellows, fanning the flames and spreading the fires with terrifying speed and intensity across the target area. The selection of the target itself revealed the cold, calculated, and utterly ruthless nature of this new phase of the air war. American war planners, using a wealth of intelligence, had meticulously selected specific areas of Tokyo where Japan's cottage industries were concentrated. These were not massive, easily identifiable factories, but countless small, family-run workshops, integrated seamlessly within dense residential zones that produced essential aircraft parts, electrical equipment, and precision instruments. Intelligence officers had consulted detailed, pre-war maps of Tokyo produced by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, meticulously ranking the city's wards by their population density, building material composition, and infrastructure vulnerability, often utilizing the Japanese government's own pre-war urban planning and fire insurance documents. The selected target zone in northeastern Tokyo, a 12-square-mile area encompassing the Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa wards, was identified as the most flammable and strategically valuable target of its kind in the world. It was a labyrinth of working-class neighborhoods with an extremely high population density, where extended families lived in traditional, lightweight wooden and paper structures, separated by narrow, winding alleys that would act as natural chimneys in a firestorm. The weapon chosen for this task, the M69 incendiary bomblet, represented the cutting edge of chemical warfare technology. It was a deceptively simple-looking device, a hexagonal steel pipe, 3 inches in diameter and 20 inches long, weighing just over 6 pounds. But unlike earlier thermite or magnesium-based incendiary designs, which burned hotter but could be more easily extinguished, the M69 was filled with napalm, the newly developed and terrifyingly effective jellied gasoline that had been co-developed by scientists at Standard Oil and Harvard University. The bomblets were dropped in E-46 aimable clusters, large bomb casings that would carry 38 of the individual bomblets and were designed to break open at an altitude of 2,000 feet. As each individual M69 bomblet fell, a small cotton streamer would deploy from its tail, orienting it so that its fuse would strike the ground first. Upon impact, a time delay fuse would burn for 3 to 5 seconds before a white phosphorus charge ignited the main napalm filling. This delayed action was a crucial and sinister feature, ensuring that the bomblet would have time to punch through a roof and come to rest on its side inside a building before it detonated. When it did, it would violently disperse the flaming, sticky napalm in multiple directions, plastering it onto walls and ceilings over a distance of up to 100 feet. Extensive and secret testing at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where the U.S. Army had constructed a detailed, full-scale replica of a Japanese residential block, had proven the M69's horrifying effectiveness. The weapon was designed to create thousands of simultaneous, widely dispersed ignition points that would instantly overwhelm any conventional firefighting efforts. The napalm itself adhered to any surface it touched and was incredibly resistant to being extinguished by water. A single B-29 on this mission carried 40 of these cluster bombs, containing a total of 1,520 individual bomblets. With 279 bombers ultimately reaching the target out of the 325 that were launched, Operation Meeting House would drop approximately 424,000 of these individual incendiary devices on Tokyo, creating an unprecedented and almost unimaginable concentration of fire. American planners had coldly calculated that this density of ignition points, combined with the strong winds, would almost certainly create a self-sustaining conflagration or firestorm, a phenomenon where thousands of individual fires would merge, generating their own powerful, hurricane-force wind currents that would spread the inferno far beyond the initial impact zone. The first B-29, its silver skin reflecting the runway lights, lifted off from the Coral Runway on Guam just after 5:30 p.m. on the evening of March 9th. It was piloted by the overall mission commander, the imposing Brigadier General Thomas Sarsfield Power of the 314th Bombardment Wing. Over the next several hours, a relentless stream of bombers took off at 50-second intervals from the three island bases, a river of aluminum and high-octane fuel flowing north towards Japan. The grueling, 14-hour round trip would test both the men and their complex machines to the absolute limits of their operational endurance. The crews, foregoing their heavy, electrically heated flight suits, flew in lighter gear, taking advantage of the warmer temperatures at the much lower altitudes. Without the immense weight of the defensive guns, the gunners themselves, and their thousands of rounds of ammunition, the B-29s climbed with a surprising and welcome efficiency, conserving precious fuel during the long 1,500-mile journey to Japan. As the massive bomber stream approached the coast of the Japanese home islands, the iconic, snow-capped peak of Mount Fuji, visible in the faint moonlight, served as a prominent and final navigation checkpoint. The first air raid sirens began their mournful, wailing cry across Tokyo at around 10:30 p.m., but most of the city's inhabitants, accustomed to the high-altitude raids of the past, initially remained in their homes. The previous raids from 30,000 feet had caused relatively limited and scattered damage, creating a dangerous and widespread sense of complacency. Tokyo's civil defense preparations, as a result, were tragically and fatally inadequate for the apocalyptic storm that was about to be unleashed upon them. The entire city of over 4 million residents had only 18 large, concrete air raid shelters, capable of protecting a mere 90,000 people. Most families were forced to rely on primitive bongo, shallow, hastily dug trenches in their backyards, often covered with flimsy wooden boards or simple dugouts that offered minimal, if any, protection against the unique horror of incendiary bombs. The city's 8,000 professional firefighters were equipped primarily with hand-cranked pumps and bucket brigades, tools designed for peacetime emergencies, not for a city-killing conflagration. The neighborhood associations had organized civilian firefighting groups, but these were composed primarily of elderly residents, women, and teenagers, equipped with little more than sand buckets and water-filled containers. The first of the Pathfinder B-29s arrived over the sleeping city at 12:08 a.m. on March 10th. They approached from different directions, flying at a terrifyingly low 5,000 feet, and dropped their M47 napalm bombs to mark the target zone. These larger bombs immediately created huge, brilliant fire markers on the ground, forming an enormous, burning X over the heart of the Shitamachi district. The main bomber force began arriving just minutes later, a continuous, unending stream of silver giants. Their bombardiers, looking through their simple sights, had the easiest aiming task of their lives. Simply dropped their massive loads of incendiaries into the heart of the brightly illuminated, burning marker. The weather conditions on the ground proved to be even more significant than the planners had hoped. The clear visibility was perfect for the bombardiers, and the strong surface winds, gusting at times up to 45 miles per hour, immediately began to whip the thousands of small, nascent fires into a frenzy. Within minutes, thousands of individual fires, sparked by the M69 bomblets, erupted simultaneously across the target zone. The strong winds, just as predicted, quickly spread the flames from one flimsy wooden building to the next, merging the separate blazes into a massive, roaring conflagration. The temperatures at ground level quickly exceeded an incredible 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, a heat so intense that it was sufficient to melt glass, boil the water in canals, and buckle steel infrastructure. The superheated air, rising with incredible force, created powerful updrafts, generating intense, tornado-like wind vortices that tore the roofs off buildings and lifted burning debris high into the air. The narrow streets became impassable as the asphalt on their surfaces ignited and boiled, and the wooden buildings on either side collapsed inward from the extreme, radiant heat. The deafening roar of the inferno overwhelmed all other noise, a sound that survivors would later describe as the sound of the world ending, while the dense, choking smoke and the searing heat reduced visibility to mere feet, turning the familiar neighborhoods into a terrifying, unrecognizable hellscape. 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto was at her family's home in Tokyo's Sumida district, a densely packed neighborhood of artisans and small shopkeepers, cradling her 13-month-old baby when the attack began. Her husband, an army officer, was away on guard duty across the city. She would later provide a harrowing, invaluable testimony for historical records, her words painting a vivid and terrifying picture of the unfolding apocalypse. The B-29s, flying so low we felt we could almost touch them, were dropping countless firebombs, she recalled. It sounded like a torrential, heavy rain, a metallic clattering on the rooftops all around us. I was utterly astounded to see the intensity of the air raid. I had seen the vapor trails of the high-altitude raids before, but I had never experienced anything like this. As thousands of fires erupted simultaneously, spreading with a terrifying, unnatural speed, Yoshiko fled with her elderly parents, her precious baby, and her sisters into the streets, which were already choked with thousands of other evacuating residents. The narrow, labyrinthine alleys of the Shitamachi district, a source of neighborhood charm and peacetime, now became deadly, suffocating traps as thousands of terrified people, blinded by smoke and driven by primal fear, attempted to escape the inferno at the same time. In the chaos and the darkness, illuminated only by the raging fires, parents became tragically and permanently separated from their children. Elderly residents who fell in the panicked rush were simply trampled underfoot, unable to continue. The valiant but overwhelmed civilian firefighting brigades were forced to abandon their useless hand pumps and bucket lines when the radiant heat from the approaching flames became so intense that it was impossible to even approach the fire front. At the Sumida River, which the fleeing crowds hoped would be a firebreak and a source of salvation, Yoshiko witnessed scenes of almost unimaginable chaos and horror. Burning debris was falling all around us like a hellish snow, she testified. And the wind, it was not a normal wind. It was a roaring, violent force, intensifying with every passing minute. Burning materials, large wooden signboards, entire doors, and household items were being lifted high into the air, flying around like leaves in a hurricane. The massive warehouses that lined both banks of the river were completely engulfed in flames, turning the water itself into a terrifying, reflecting pool of fire. In a desperate last-ditch act to save his daughter and grandchild, her father pushed both Yoshiko and her baby into the frigid, oily water of the river. This instinctive action ultimately saved their lives, but her mother, who was right beside them, perished in the inferno, along with Yoshiko's father and her sister, Itsuko. Across the burning district, similar, heartbreaking tragedies were occurring on a mass scale. Those who sought refuge in the city's numerous canals and waterways soon discovered that the water was no sanctuary. In many places, the surface was boiling from the intense heat of the fires raging on the banks. Others were simply overwhelmed and drowned in the panicked, stampeding rush as thousands of people tried to reach the water at the same time. The firestorm's own winds, generated by the immense heat, were now powerful enough to literally pick people up and move them significant distances, and some victims were later found hundreds of yards from where their families had last seen them. The designated safe havens, police stations, hospitals, and large elementary schools became death traps. At the Kikukawa Elementary School, a large, modern building that had been designated as an official shelter, investigators in the following days found a horrifying scene. The building was a hollowed-out, fire-gutted shell. Inside, where hundreds of people had sought safety, they found only a tangled mass of melted metal objects and the charred, unrecognizable remains of those who had been incinerated by the superheated air. The ancient and beautiful Buddhist temples that had stood for centuries were completely destroyed, along with the countless souls who had sought a final, desperate shelter within their sacred grounds. The extreme, oxygen-starved conditions created by the inferno meant that even those in shelters faced a terrible death from heat, asphyxiation, and the searing, superheated air, which caused catastrophic respiratory damage to anyone who was exposed to it, even for a few moments. In the aftermath of the raid, the exact number of casualties was difficult to determine, and the estimates varied significantly among different authorities. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, in its post-war analysis, calculated a conservative figure of 87,793 fatalities and 40,918 injuries. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department, in its own grim accounting, reported 83,793 deaths and 40,918 wounded. The Tokyo Fire Department, whose members had witnessed the horror firsthand, estimated a staggering 97,000 killed and 125,000 wounded. However, the modern historical consensus, based on survivor testimonies and demographic analysis, indicates that over 100,000 people died in that single night, a death toll that exceeds the immediate casualties from either of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The physical destruction was almost absolute. The attack completely destroyed 267,171 buildings across 15.8 square miles of the city, eliminating a full 25% of Tokyo's total structures in just a few hours. Over 1 million survivors lost their homes, becoming refugees in their own country. The industrial impact was also severe and immediate. More than half of Tokyo's light manufacturing, particularly the production of crucial war materials, occurred in the thousands of small workshops within these residential areas. Their complete and total destruction significantly and permanently disrupted the production of essential war materials. Thousands of highly skilled workers, machinists, technicians, and craftsmen, were either killed or displaced from the city, their irreplaceable skills lost to the war effort forever. American losses, in almost surreal contrast, were comparatively minimal. 14 B-29s failed to return from the mission, with 96 airmen listed as either killed or missing. Several of the bombers had encountered severe, bone-jarring turbulence from the massive thermal updrafts created by the firestorm below, causing a complete loss of control. Others sustained critical damage from the sporadic, but sometimes accurate anti-aircraft fire during their low-level runs, as the Japanese gunners struggled to track the fast-moving aircraft at such unusual and unexpected altitudes. The air crews who survived would later report being able to smell the scent of burning wood and flesh even at their operational altitude, a horrifying and sobering experience that would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. The crews who had initially questioned the wisdom and morality of LeMay's radical new tactics were sobered by the operation's terrifying scale and undeniable impact. General LeMay himself would later reflect on the profound moral implications with his characteristic bluntness. "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." General Arnold, upon receiving the initial damage reports, sent a simple but telling message of congratulations. "This mission shows your crews have the guts for anything." The undeniable, catastrophic success of the operation immediately and fundamentally influenced American strategy. Within the next 10 days, similar, large-scale incendiary raids struck Japan's other major cities of Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, effectively gutting the industrial hearts of the nation's four largest urban centers. The campaign was then forced to pause, not by Japanese resistance, but only because the XXI Bomber Command had completely exhausted its entire forward-deployed supply of incendiary bombs. Production back in the United States was immediately and massively increased, with American factories prioritizing the manufacturing of the M69. The contrast between American and Japanese capabilities had now reached its absolute and maximum disparity. While the United States could replace its lost B-29s within a matter of weeks, Japan could not possibly rebuild its destroyed urban areas or replace its lost skilled workers. American industrial production now exceeded Japan's by a factor of more than 10 to 1. The B-29 program's staggering $3 billion cost was, in itself, greater than Japan's entire military budget for the year of 1945. And while America was now producing over 50,000 tons of incendiary bombs monthly, Japan was struggling to maintain even the most basic supplies of ammunition for its armed forces. The methodical and almost scientific nature of the American operations reflected a new and terrifyingly efficient approach to warfare. The U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service had meticulously constructed detailed, full-scale replicas of typical Japanese neighborhoods at the Dugway Proving Ground in the Utah Desert, using authentic, pre-war Japanese architectural plans in order to test the effectiveness of various incendiary devices. The Standard Oil Development Company had created napalm through extensive and well-funded chemical research, and academics from Harvard and the University of Chicago had contributed analytical studies on the complex physics of fire propagation in urban environments. This seamless integration of scientific research with military operations stood in stark contrast to the Japanese military doctrine, which continued to emphasize traditional warrior values and fighting spirit over material and technological considerations, an approach that was proving to be suicidally inadequate against the overwhelming, industrialized methods of modern warfare. Japan's utter inability to develop any effective countermeasures to these raids demonstrated a profound strategic and technological limitation. Despite a preliminary, smaller-scale incendiary raid on February 25th that had destroyed 28,000 buildings and served as a clear warning, the authorities made only minimal and ineffective improvements to their fire defenses. Sensible proposals to create wide fire breaks by proactively demolishing buildings were not implemented due to bureaucratic inertia and a lack of resources. Evacuation plans remained largely theoretical and poorly communicated, and the military authorities, in a display of tragic stubbornness, continued to insist that civilians should remain in the cities to maintain war production, even as their own intelligence indicated that massive, city-destroying incendiary raids were being planned. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound, lasting, and transformative. Many described a deep and abiding sense that all of their traditional systems of protection, the government, the military, their own neighborhood associations, had completely and utterly failed them. The refugees who streamed out of the smoldering ruins of Tokyo spread their terrifying, first-hand accounts throughout the rest of Japan, their experiences directly and powerfully contradicting the optimistic official propaganda that was still being broadcast about the war situation. In the aftermath of the raids, Worker attendance at the surviving factories and other cities declined significantly as civilians lost all confidence in their government's ability to protect them. The term routine air raid entered the common Japanese usage as city after city was systematically and relentlessly targeted. By August of 1945, a staggering 66 Japanese cities had experienced major incendiary attacks, with much of urban Japan lying in ruins even before the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred. The historical irony remains that the profound and catastrophic impact of this single operation was soon overshadowed by the advent of the atomic bombs 5 months later. The greater immediate death toll of the March 10th raid became a less prominent historical fact when compared to the unique, world-changing nature of the nuclear weapons, a historical quirk that has allowed the broader realities of conventional firebombing to receive far less scrutiny in the post-war era. The statistics of the raid can only provide a partial, sterile understanding of the event. 325 B-29s launched, 279 reaching the target, 1,665 tons of incendiaries dropped, 15.8 square miles of a city annihilated, 267,171 buildings utterly destroyed, over 100,000 people killed, and over 1 million left homeless. But behind each of these staggering numbers were individuals, American Air crew members, many of whom were just boys, stoically executing their military orders, Japanese families, huddling in their flimsy wooden homes, children screaming in the darkness, permanently separated from their parents, and survivors forced to deal with the profound and irreplaceable losses for the rest of their lives. Operation Meeting House remains, by the grim metric of immediate death and destruction, the single most destructive air raid in human history. It serves not as a triumphant military achievement, but as a sobering, terrifying reminder of the awesome and indiscriminate capacity of modern warfare for destruction, a world where cold, strategic objectives can justify an almost unimaginable level of civilian impact, and where entire populations can become the direct and intended targets of industrial-scale conflict. Больше, https://synonym.org/se